In this chapter, I'll be discussing the U.S. government's role in housing and mortgages starting in the early 1930s. In 1933, the U.S. government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is very important to the discussion about mortgages and redlining. In 1934, the government created the National Housing Act. In 1934, there was another housing act, but this one is important, the first one. And in 1934, they created the Federal Housing Administration. All of these were part of then President Franklin D. Roosevelt's, or FDR's, New Deal. There's actually two New Deals. People talk about the New Deal, but there was two New Deals. It's very important that we recognize FDR during the Great Depression and everything that he did to rebuild or save America from the Great Depression. There's a lot of positive things that FDR did. In this case, for this course, I'll focus on some of the negative consequences of the New Deal policies. The federal government, under FDR, for the first time, entered the private housing sector by financing home mortgages, typically relegated to the private sector during this period. Now, before FDR and the New Deal, President Hoover and all other presidents, previous presidents, pretty much practiced what they refer to as laissez-faire economics. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that everyone before FDR believed that the market will correct itself, that the government should not interfere in private affairs. The government should not interfere in property rights. The government should not interfere in housing and mortgages or anything of that nature. That the market itself will fix these ills in terms of inequality. So Hoover, for example, President Hoover, before FDR, during the Great Depression or during the start of the Great Depression, he didn't do anything. He didn't intervene to save the banks. He didn't intervene to save the mortgages, the foreclosures. He didn't do anything. And this laissez-faire economics is literally a myth in terms of how society works. Planning is very important because planning is a form of intervention. When we have social inequalities, planning can be used to address those inequalities, to close those gaps. But like anything, it's a double-edged sword. So planning can be used for good in creating parks, and it can be used for bad in creating racial segregation. So think about it as a tool. So today as planners, we can use our planning skills and tools for good, or we can use it for bad. In this case, for the government to intervene, in my expert opinion, it was necessary because millions of Americans were losing their homes due to the Great Depression. Millions were losing their lands, the farms. They were foreclosing. There was extremely high unemployment. So you needed government to intervene to make sure that the banks would not close at the rate they were closing. So for the first time, you see insurance that the FDR implemented rules and laws that banks needed to insure people's monies. Because if not, during crisis, they take their money, and that creates more crisis. And there has to be emergency support for mortgages when there's a crisis, where the government lends people money at low interest, where the government helps refinance. And so this is all of these acts and administrations in regards to housing that took place under this context. So given that I'm very supportive of these efforts, not that I was alive during FDR, but given that I'm a big supporter of government intervening and helping poor people, helping people in distress, we also have to recognize some of the negative aspects of the New Deal. With the HOLC, for example, it created these residential security maps responsible for redlining neighborhoods and promoting racial segregation in housing by using these color-coded maps. Why do they call it redlining? Where does that come from? The color red was used to create these maps, and where there was red, it meant that it was detrimental influences or it was high risk. It was a high risk area. And typically those were places where there were people of color, blacks and Latinos and Latinas. Blues, there was low risk, and typically it was privileged whites that lived there. Now, let's say there's whites that live in the red area, in working class whites or immigrant whites, ethnic whites, right? So there was a time where Irish, the Italians, people of Jewish religion, they lived in these working class neighborhoods. But once the government says, okay, these are detrimental, we're going to label these as high risk, what that means is that to get a mortgage in a high risk area is more expensive than to get a mortgage in a blue or green area. So if you're white and if you have a good job, you want to move out of that red area and move into a blue or green area, and the government will help you. But if you're black or brown, you're relegated, you're trapped in that neighborhood, because even if you want to move, they don't allow you to move because of discrimination in these white neighborhoods. These so-called undesirable neighborhoods that were marked in red, like high risk, the way the government treated them, and also real estate agents and banks, had to do with they were most likely to default. So therefore, we have to increase the rates where in places where whites didn't want to live there anymore, if they were living there. Also think about it in terms of a car, like when you have car insurance. And this is the contradiction of America, of American capitalism, is poor people pay more for car insurance than rich people. So if you go to East Los Angeles, where I grew up, my motherland, and you have a car, let's just say any regular car, you're going to pay more in insurance because it's a high area, it's a high risk area, than another person with the same car in Brentwood or Beverly Hills, because it's a low risk area. So essentially, poor people pay more money in mortgages to the present, in car insurance, and because of the area. And planners, architects, designers, government, real estate, they were all complicit in these maps, not just in creating them, but in enforcing them. So what happens as a result? So what happens when the government says, if you're a white family, you're living in Boyle Heights, because there was a time in Boyle Heights. Right now, Boyle Heights is pretty much all Latino, Latinas, like 99%. Or it's a high percentage, but there was a time in Boyle Heights, which is part of East LA or in East Los Angeles. There was a time in the mid-1900s where African Americans lived there, Japanese Americans lived there, Jewish Americans lived there, Mexicans. It was like a melting pot. Everybody from all these beautiful cultures and languages, lived in one place called Boyle Heights. Once the government creates these maps, once these maps are enforced, and a white family wants to buy a house, they're going to go to the San Fernando Valley because it's cheaper to buy a house there than to buy one in East Los Angeles. So what ends up happening? You have white flight. So white flight has to do with during this time period where there were incentives for whites to leave the inner city and to go to the suburbs, because the suburbs were low risk. And for them to buy a home, their interest rates were lower and they'll most likely qualify because the government supported them and so on and so forth. So during this time period, we're looking at the 1930s, 40s, 50s, which will lead us into urban renewal, which I'll discuss, where it all started with the FDR, with the New Deal, in creating these agencies and these administrations in terms of housing, and the importance of housing and how housing directly influences racial segregation by having these racial coded maps. So likewise, what you see is when whites flee the suburbs, we're looking 1930s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, then African Americans and Latinos and Latinas remain in the inner cities, and also Asian Americans and others. And those places are neglected. Here's an example of the map in Illinois. It's hard to see the words here, but the blue and the green are low risk, and then the red are high risk. Now, if you look at these maps and you see the people that live there, once they were designed, let's say 5 years, 10 years later, it will pretty much coincide that where there's red, you have a high percentage of African Americans living here. And whereas blue and green, you have a high percentage of whites living there. If we look at Los Angeles, this is the case. Los Angeles, even to the present, is a highly segregated city. Now, I grew up in East LA. I'm from the East Side. And now I live in West LA because I'm like a big-time professor and all that. And I feel and I see the difference in terms of racial segregation. In other words, when I go to the store in West LA, I literally, like a year can go by without me seeing an African-American person. But when you live in a community, you don't think about it that way. You just think like, oh, everything's normal or that's just the way it is. But there's a history behind this. And these maps, these color-coded maps and how they were influenced and implemented by people that are influential, planners, architects, designers, government, real estate agents, banks, create these situations where we see how racial segregation has been reinforced in this country from the beginning to the present. And once again, these maps, we're looking early 1900s, mid 1900s to the 60s, 70s. And even when they weren't practiced anymore, even when they stopped using them, those same families that lived in these places, as I stated before, their wealth is passed down to their children and their children. And this is another example of a map, a little closer look in the case of Philadelphia. And here we can see the way they're labeled in terms of the green, the blues, best, and the red is hazardous. So all of the maps were a little different by place. But it was the same idea. So when someone says redlining, a lot of times we just say, okay, that means segregation. But there's a story behind it, and that's the story. That has to do with the color red, and it has to do when they highlighted and they colored that section red, the government designated that's a bad area. If we're going to give you money, if we're going to give you a loan, then you're going to have to pay more in terms of interest. And for a lot of poor people who can't even buy a home, they end up staying there because they can't move anywhere, and they end up becoming renters. But they grew up in this environment. Their kids attend bad schools. They end up living in the same environment. So it's like a cycle of poverty that repeats itself throughout time. Now, that's not to say that it happens to everybody. I grew up poor and I'm not poor anymore. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that as planners, whether we're academics, practitioners, or students, we need to be critical and we need to look at things historically and critically and not be simplistic about it and blame the same people that are in poverty for their poverty. Now, there's people and there's institutions that benefit from poverty and segregation. These are two excellent sources. One is Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning. And the second one is Mapping Inequality Redlining in the New Deal America. And in these interactive web pages, you can see, if you just put in a zip code, it'll show you the neighborhood of the past and even the present in terms of how these maps work. And also it gives you an idea of how racial inequality continues to the present. Now, without these maps, without this history, once again, we come to simple-minded conclusions that people of color want to live with other people of color, so that's why they're segregated. And government had nothing to do with it. Or if government had something to do with it, like in the case of slavery or the race restrictive covenants, that happened in the past. That has nothing to do with today. So what I argue is that, well, all of us are not responsible for anything that happened 100 years ago because we weren't born. We still benefit from it. And so those of us who have privilege, those of us who have some privilege, that we need to use that privilege to educate ourselves and to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past.